Dr. Winter, just a couple of points on the issue of self-sufficiency. Lord Owen told us when he gave his evidence that the pledge he had in mind encompassed self-sufficiency on the basis of use of factor concentrates for home treatment, but not prophylactic treatment. Do you know whether that was the understanding of clinicians, such as yourself, that what was meant by Lord Owen in relation to self-sufficiency, at least, excluded prophylaxis?
I was only a trainee doctor at the time of Dr. Owen's initiative, but our understanding of self-sufficiency was always that it would encompass all aspects of haemophilia treatment.
Thank you. And then the second point, it's not necessarily a question for you, Dr. Winter, but it's just a point I've been asked by some call participants to raise. In relation to the position in Scotland, I'm asked to point out that commercial concentrates were, as a matter of fact, being used in parts of Scotland in the early 1980s. But as I say, I didn't think that's really a question for you. It just arose out of your evidence.
But they did end up in a situation where not only were they self-sufficient, they had extra capacity, I believe.
And
there was even a suggestion that some of this, that they might provide factor VIII for some English patients.
Yes. Then you told us yesterday when we were talking about telling children about their HIV diagnosis, and we referred to the talk that you had given expressly on that subject. And you mentioned a Scottish group who delivered a talk on the possibility of not telling children their diagnosis. Who was that Scottish group?
I honestly can't remember. They would have been from one of the major centres. They were counsellors and nurses, I think, from one of the major centres, which would have been Glasgow or Edinburgh or Dundee, I guess. And
what did you understand their main counter-argument to be? What was the reason being advanced by them for not telling children?
I think their main argument was that whilst the children were well, this would only distress them, and that until we had more knowledge, it was perhaps best not to tell them. All these years later, it's difficult, but I do remember it as being quite a powerful occasion because of the two divergent views in front of really quite a large audience, who again were very split as to whether you should tell or whether you shouldn't tell. And again, no agency saying to us, this is what you should do. We had Dr. Krask saying, you could tell, but maybe you don't need to. And each director must do what they think is best, the familiar thing. So again, it was another moment of great uncertainty.
And do you remember when the particular occasion that you're talking about, where there was this discussion and your talk was delivered? Do you remember when that was, very roughly?
Well, obviously it was, so we're talking, I'm thinking it must be at the very end of 1984, the results would have been through, and people are working out what to do with the results, of one of which was to say, should we tell children? I'm tempted to say very early 85.
Okay, thank you. And then can I clarify one aspect or ask you to clarify one aspect of your evidence in relation to how, or your approach to the treatment of severe haemophiliacs, severe regularly treated haemophiliacs, in the period from early 1983, when you're aware of the risk of HIV, through to May 1984, when you made the switch to the heat-treated product. Was your approach and your advice to carry on as normal with heat-treated product, with unheated product, or was it advice to treat only when necessary and to try and reduce the amount that you received?
Yes, it was the latter. It was to say we have increasing concerns, firstly because of the hepatitis data, secondly because of this new disorder which seems to be in the blood supply. We're trying to reach a situation where factor VIII might be treated to make it safer, but in the meantime you should only use concentrate when you need to, I guess was a core phrase and a core belief that we had round the centre, and that extended, as we've discussed, to restricting operations and restricting prophylaxis, etc.
And then I've been asked to ask you to clarify your references to being a trainee doctor when you were at the Middlesex and Guy's, because obviously the precise way in which different categories of doctor are described may not be universally known and understood. So
Yes.
What was your qualification, and what did you mean by saying you were a trainee doctor at that time?
So obviously I was a qualified doctor, that's 5 years of training. Then everybody has to do a year's house physician, so then you're registered. So I was a registered doctor, but then if you're going to work in a hospital, you enter speciality training. So you are a trainee in that speciality, even though you are a registered doctor. So that was what I meant by that phrase.
And so that period, the Middlesex and then Guy's, you were a senior registrar, or a registrar.
A senior registrar for 7 years in further training.
As a haematologist.
Yes.
Thank you.
And then you end up with this other exam, the MRC PATH, and that they now formally call it accreditation. And then you're qualified to become a specialist.
Thank you. And then in terms of the communications you had with patients, and I'm not going to go back over the detail of what was being said to patients at different times. The question I'm asked to ask you is about the extent to which, in the period we've been looking at, late 70s, first half of the 80s, to what extent would this kind of discussion be recorded by you in the patient's notes?
I stress that yet again, I was in training and not responsible for policy, but my general recollection would be that hospital notes are a variable feast, firstly. Some doctors write, no doctor writes very voluminous notes because you're doing a busy clinic with lots of patients and you don't have time to write a great deal. Some patients for a clinic visit would write a very brief, all well, no new symptoms to report, 3 months and a little initials. It would be, in those days, I think, unusual for, in the notes, where the doctors actually got to handwrite it, to say, I have counselled this patient against the situation concerning the latest evidence for hepatitis infection. What would be much more likely, and I've seen some of my own correspondence from the time, is that when we actually wrote a letter to the GP at the end of the clinic into a dictaphone, it was much easier to give more detail, and the letters to the GP would be much more likely to say, I've reviewed your patient, he's perfectly well, I've brought him up to date with the evolving situation concerning possible hepatitis infection in haemophilia patients, or something like that.
Thank you. And then in the first half of the 80s, but in particular 1982 to 1983, did you, and I'm conscious of this time you're not a consultant, did you put forward any of your patients, in particular mild haemophiliacs or those who were virgin haemophiliacs, pups, for any clinical trials?
No.
We talked about the approach to children. Can I just ask you to clarify, up until what age, for the purposes of the discussion that we've been having, would you regard someone as a child for the purpose of the treatment decisions?
Well, I think for the semantic discussions as to what is a child. When I said to you, to my best recollection of my 30-something, there were 15, 16, I would have included up to the age of 18.
And in terms of the guidance that came from UK HCDO, for example, in the middle of 1983 about how clinicians might want to treat children, would that be pretty much all children up to the age of 18?
Yes. To complicate matters, obviously in some cities, like with Great Ormond Street or Birmingham Children's, there wasn't even a standard age of transition to the adult centre. So this was another area of not contention, but there wasn't some standardisation of practice.
Now, I want to ask you to look at a document that has been shown to you this morning. It's a Haemophilia Society publication. Henry, could we have DHSC 0001228, please? Thank you. So this is the Haemophilia Society letter of the 4th of May 1983, which sets out advice from Professor Bloom that was then sent out by the Haemophilia Society to its members. And the reason I'm asking you about this, Dr. Winter, is because you talked about information from the Haemophilia Society as one of the sources of information for patients. Do you know whether you read this or would have been likely to have read this at the time?
No, I remember in particular covering this letter in detail at the two previous inquiries.
In that case, can I invite you to set out what you can recall about this letter and what your view is of the advice that's contained within it?
Well, here's a doctor looking at an evolving situation and with the best of intentions trying to be helpful. Professor Bloom was an awfully gentle, charming man who, always tried to do his best. But he's given advice here to the Haemophilia Society, which has gone on to patients, which has turned out to be completely wrong. And some of his phraseology, given that it's in a state of great uncertainty with the evolving numbers of patients, and indeed, we should say, was it not almost exactly the same date that the patient in his own centre was diagnosed with this disease, which he thinks isn't going to be a problem to people with haemophilia. So when he says the cause of AIDS is quite unknown, if quite means completely, which I assume it does, that was a strange use of phrase, because any sentient doctor looking at the data would have to say there must be a very high chance it's due to a transmissible agent in blood. And if it's in blood, the hemophiliacs will be the most affected. So that's a very strange choice of phrase, and it's not been proven to result from transmission. Well, there are patients with haemophilia with the disorder. So that's a strange choice of phrase. And then it's interesting, I haven't seen this before. I was talking yesterday about the German experience. Here he is again putting out, as some people with his views did, this is an American problem. If anything, it's not going to occur in British donated plasma. And look at the Germans. They use twice as much as us, and they had no problems. So can we look lower down the letter?
Certainly.
Yes, so that's the phrase, isn't it, that stands out as being so very inappropriate. One wonders why he didn't say we're monitoring the situation very closely, and we're trying to get as much information as we can as to whether this might be an evolving issue for patients with haemophilia. And as soon as we have more information, we'll get it to you. It's the sort of certainty of saying the cause is quite unknown. Well, there were significant clues.
And Dr. Winter, was this a communication that you saw at the time? I don't know whether you can answer that, but
I would have been, yes. I mean, I read I've been a member of the Haemophilia Society myself since the late 1970s, so I would have been sent this document.
But do you have any memory of reading it and reacting to it?
Not at the time as a registrar. I mean, I must have read it and thought that's a strange thing to say.
Just before we leave that letter, the third from last sentence. In addition, the importation of licensed blood products has always been strictly monitored and controlled. would you understand the implication of that as being, the product must be safe because otherwise it wouldn't be let into the country?
Well, that's another big issue, isn't it? What factors are taken into account when a product is licensed, and did the people or the agencies in Britain granting that license, were they aware of the sort of events that had been portrayed in the World in Action documentary? Because surely if they had, would they not have had major reservations about granting a product license? I don't know if the inquiry has as yet had a chance to talk to the sort of people who would have granted such a license to commercial concentrate.
The next passage, which I just would like to invite your comment on, I appreciate it is only a comment and you may be considering this for the first time, though you've looked at this letter before, is we should, at the very last sentence, we should give those experts who are responsible a chance continually to assess the situation. At that time, what experts did you see as being responsible for the quality of the factor product given from the States to individuals in this country?
Well, I think obviously in terms of the license, it's the agency that would grant the license. They surely must have had criteria to use behind the licensing of any blood product or drug. But I think what he actually means is he really means the other haemophilia doctors are going to continually to assess the situation. He is actually not referring to the agency. I think he means that doctors like him are keeping a very close eye for any sign of their patients getting this new disease.
So it's leave it to us.
That's what I think he means.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Winch, I'm going to move on now to ask you about various matters from 1985 onwards. Can I have up on screen, please, Henry, ARMO 40409, please. So this is a letter from ARMA to you, June 1985, heat-treated factor VIII batch number Y69402. It thanks you for the information given in your letter of the 10th of June. I don't think we have that letter, I'm afraid, so we only have what's set out here. And then it says, in view of the fact that all three patients were HTLV positive prior to receiving that batch, any symptoms will be virtually impossible to relate to the factor VIII batch in question. Nevertheless, in the generation of an overall picture of all patients treated with the batch, the subsequent progress of these patients will be of interest. Just two questions arising out of this, Dr. Winter. The first is, do you recall why you were writing to ARMA about that particular batch?
So this is quite a common occurrence in haemophilia treatment. As a standard practice, if a doctor gives a patient a product and there is a problem with that administration of the treatment of any kind, the doctor informs the company for obvious reasons, so that they can look at the batch and make sure that other hospitals who've received that same batch are not getting the same problems. And that would range from, at the extreme end, the development of an inhibitor. You would notify the company. Maybe in the manufacture of that batch something had happened and the batch was more antigenic than other batches. That would be an extreme example. Almost certainly what this related to was that the patients were getting some sort of side effect during administration of the sort of type that we were talking about with cryoprecipitate. So I expect these patients came to me, they were probably all on home therapy, and said, actually, I've got the shivers and the shakes with this one, which could happen with concentrates. And I felt obliged to report this. The reply is rather curious. I don't know why. I've obviously informed them. I would not have given the names of the patients, obviously. I would have said 3 patients under my care, and then I would have given I would have said they've got severe haemophilia and they're HTLV positive, and they've got these clinical signs, and they've obviously then had some event under the treatment, and I'm just letting you know as a courtesy in case it's a problem that's being seen in other patients. But quite why he's talked about their positivity and the lymphadenopathy, I don't know.
Okay.
But this was a perfectly standard thing, and there will be lots of letters like this.
And it talks about, in the next paragraph, it says the subsequent progress of these patients will be of interest. Was that normal for a pharmaceutical company to ask for an update about the progress of particular patients?
I think he's just being courteous. No, it wouldn't. You wouldn't. You're just reporting the adverse event. You wouldn't expect to write further to the company.
Okay, thank you. Now, I don't think I need to put the documents up on screen, but we've got a sample of your returns from 1986, 1988, 1989. What they show is you are predominantly using alpha product, as you had been since middle of May 1984, although obviously it may move on to further generations of that, with some NHS product. Was there any particular thinking behind the continuing with the alpha product as your predominant mode of treatment in the second half of the 80s?
Well, firstly, as a principle, you try not to change treatment in haemophilia. It's not considered to be a good idea. There are practicalities. The patient, all the factor rates are drawn up in rather a different way according to the packs that the company provide. So the patients didn't like changing, the nurses didn't like changing. So it was you weren't going to change unless there were a reason. Of course, from May 1984, I was greatly reassured because I knew my patients were, well, I had hoped, I didn't know, at least I'd got my patients onto a heat-treated product, and I had reason to believe that was likely to be safe against HIV, which turned out to be true. I didn't know whether it was going to protect them from hepatitis, which turned out not to be true, but nearly all my patients had hepatitis anyway. So if you like, there was no clinical pressure. I could get the supplies, that was a major issue. Here's a time when Elstree, in its new shape and form, after all the funding, is taking off. It's still not firing in all cylinders. There's a lot of demand for Elstree product, as ever, for the new heat-treated product. So I'm, through the early part of the years from 1984, together with Dr. Savage, we're pretty comfortable with where we are. What happens then is new generations of heat-treated products come in, where you heat them for longer and to a higher temperature. And then we move into a yet a further generation of what's called monoclonally treated, where there are antibodies in the preparation which pick out any viruses or proteins or whatever. And they were generally perceived as being, you remember our conversations yesterday, not only safer, but purer. So you move into a different generation of products which turn out for the first time to inactivate hepatitis, which the first generation heat-treated don't do, but are also much purer. And remember my comments of purer might also mean safer. So I'm thinking that around 87, 88, you're going to say that I moved across to away from alpha to using other drugs like monoclate and things like that. These are the third generation monoclonally derived factor VIIIs. In other words, this first generation dry heat, like the alpha and the other ones, major breakthrough, safe from HIV, but turned out not to inactivate hepatitis and also not very pure. So they were soon replaced by more sophisticated concentrates.
And then could we have up on screen, please, Henry, BAYP 50 71_001. And we'll see this is a Bayer internal document, 1st of August 1991. It's headed Coate HP Study 0101. It encloses documents which we don't currently have. And it says, I currently have all case record folders from Dr. Winter in-house, and I'm hoping to collect the remainder from St Thomas's at the end of August. I feel that a meeting will be useful to discuss the reporting of this study involving both Dr. Savage and Winter. Do you have any recollection of what this study was about?
Well, I don't. I've looked at this. It's almost certainly a pup study, and I think it's in 91. I just wonder whether the very, very early stages of being to get a recombinant product, although perhaps it's a little early for that. But we were not involved. It says phase 1 analysis, etc. We were never involved in multi-center evaluations of established products because we went an academic center. I didn't have research registrars, but we did do a small number of pup studies. So I'm tempted to think this must have been one of the new generation of monoclonal or an early recombinant. I was working very closely with Dr. Savage, who was in an academic centre with large numbers of research registrars, and he would have said to me, it may be a good idea if we consider putting some patients into this because this new product looks to be a very good one, and it would be good if we could, evaluate it and get some patients onto it as soon as possible. Of course, there was great interest and concern amongst the patients. Everybody knew about the advent of the Holy Grail recombinant, factor VIII, that wasn't from blood donors. And there was a period of time where the only way you could get recombinant was to go into a research study. So it's possible that, the dates seem a little early for me, because I'm thinking 93, 94 would have been the earliest for recombinant. But anyway, I'm just making the point some patients were very happy to enter, or parents were, because it was the only way of getting this perceived better product for their child.
And in terms of your own practice, if you had a patient, whether a previously untreated patient or otherwise, who you thought might be a suitable candidate for a study, what information would you provide to that patient? I asked that question, you'll understand, because we've heard evidence of people being enrolled in studies of which they were unaware.
Yeah. So any research study of this type has two major levels of control. Firstly, this would have been a study done with other centres, and there would be a lead investigator, perhaps Dr. Savage, and he would go to a centralised ethical committee in London called MREC, and this is the first phase of getting ethical committee approval for this study. It's absolutely impossible for any sort of research activity like this to take place without these two committees having given their approval. And the first hoop is MREC. An absolutely central part of MREC is that they have lay representatives. And the lay representatives, quite properly, would be greatly exercised at the information produced for patients. Is it understandable, comprehensible, pitched at the right level? Is the patient fully aware of their responsibilities? Does the patient or the parent have the ability to come out of the study at any time? These are very extensive procedures. Once you've got through the MREC, the individual investigators, like me in Kent, I would have to do a similar thing with my local ethical committee. So I would go to them in Canterbury and Margate and say, I'd like to take part in this study. If I said, I haven't yet got MREC approval, they would say, we can't look at this until you have. If I said, I've got MREC approval, I would go through exactly the same process with them. There'd be 2 or 3 I would have to go and physically present it, and the local lay representatives, who would be lawyers or whoever, local people of influence, would say, we absolutely want a detailed look at all the patient information, and we've got some comments to make. We'd like you to make some changes, and we'd like you to come back at our meeting next month. They would be very particular about consent forms. What was the patient actually consenting to? And all these things are, of course, right and proper. So these are very exhaustive processes. So for studies like this, which are multi-centre with a new form of factor VIII coming in, there isn't any way a patient could be entered or into this study without being aware of it.
And you would be having that dialogue directly with your own patients?
I was obliged to it, under the terms of the ethical committee.
Can I ask you next about HCV testing for your patients? Do you recall when you began hepatitis C testing?
I'm thinking my recollection would be HCV was isolated about 1989 maybe, and I'm thinking the test was about 1991. We got available access to the test. I'm thinking that sort of date.
And do you have any recollection of over what period of time you undertook the tests? Was it something that went on for a prolonged period of time, or was it that the test is available and much as you described with the HIV, you take the blood samples and you send it on?
Yeah. So I was reflecting on this overnight. I think there was a difference in practice here. With HIV, as we discussed, there was great anxiety. We were really concerned to have the test. We didn't know what the results would show. We were astounded by the results. With the Hep C test, we'd wanted to have it. We weren't expecting it to tell us anything we didn't really presumptively know. I've already said to you, I'd already told my patients, I think you've got this new virus. So I was expecting, I wanted to have the patients tested, but I was expecting that all the regularly treated patients would test positive. So I decided I would not send for them immediately like I did with HIV, where I was so concerned to know. These are all patients that had upcoming appointments. I knew I was going to be seeing them within the next few weeks. So when they came into their routine appointments, I said to them, we now have this test available. And obviously, I hope you agree, we should get this test done. And then, I said to them what I've just said to you. I said, probably, unless you're anxious, we could pick up the results of this test the next time you come. If you're really concerned, we can make another arrangement to get the test result to you more quickly. But, I really am expecting it's going to confirm kind of what we already know, is that you've got Hep C.
And so your patients, you told them or you invited them to be tested. They weren't tested without their knowledge.
No.
When you communicated the results to them, was that invariably in person at an appointment?
Always,
rather than by letter?
yes, always.
And can you recall what kind of information you provided at that early stage to those who tested positive about hepatitis C?
Well, it was really a confirmation of all the previous advice that had been given, that we now definitely know that this non-A, non-B we've been talking to you about for 15 years for severe regular patients, age 40-something, under long-term treatment. We've always said to you we think it's Hep C, and we now know for sure it is Hep C. That doesn't change the nature of our advice to you about healthy living, about avoidance of alcohol. There was very little, if any, data at all, unlike HIV, about sexual transmission, which was an area of difficulty. And something that happened that came out of the availability of Hep C testing around this time, there was availability for treatment with this interferon. Now, by then, we were in an area where haemophilia doctors were outside of their expertise. So when I was looking after my patients, I was looking after their haemophilia. As it happened, I was an HIV physician, so I was looking after their HIV. Many other centres would have sent their patients across to a different unit for HIV care, but I was not a hepatitis specialist, of course, and I didn't have detailed knowledge about a whole range of things evolving around hepatitis C now that it had been identified. I didn't really know about advice about how common was sexual transmission, and I didn't know whether a patient, now that Hep C had been confirmed, I didn't know what criteria would be used to determine whether they ought to have interferon treatment. I didn't know whether the patient should be advised to have a liver biopsy. So all of these patients, in the fullness of time, would have been referred to our liver specialist, who's Dr. Frank Muller. We didn't do formal combined clinics, but patients were referred to him for his assessment, and he would see them and write back to me and say, this is what I think, and, he would then monitor he would then take over the formal management of their hepatitis. He would do all the measurement of the liver function tests. He would advise me about liver biopsy. He would advise me about evolving treatment. Sometimes the patients were sent up to King's College in London for evaluation for liver transplantation. He, from that point in time, took over all that sort of hepatitis management, and that would have been a very sort of commonplace thing across haemophilia centres.
In terms of the prescription of interferon, and we have heard some horrific accounts of the side effects of interferon from patients. Would that have been his responsibility then, rather than yours?
Completely. I've never, as a doctor, prescribed interferon.
There is some reference in documents. I don't think, particularly in light of your last answer, I need to take you to them. In the course of the 90s, to there being difficulties in securing funding in your local area for interferon and ribavirin for patients. Did you have any involvement or recollection in that?
I had no involvement, but nobody ever said to me that funding had not been obtained. So if Dr. Muller, my colleague, he would write to me and say, we're going to start this patient on interferon and ribavirin, they started, and the patient would turn up for their next appointment with me and would say, have you heard from Dr. Muller? And I would say, yes, I hear you're on the treatment. And he would say, yes, I've started.
And your statement says it was approximately 50 patients under your care who were confirmed to have hepatitis C when the testing came in. Are you able to recall what proportion of your patients at that time, 1991 or so, did not have hepatitis C?
So now we're entering a sort of wider group from the HIV group, because you're picking up people with, say, mild haemophilia who've only had, say, 1 or 2 lifetime treatments. Mercifully, they've escaped HIV, but inevitably, as we've been discussing, because they've had factor VIII before 1985-6, they've got Hep C. So that's why we've got this wider group of people with Hep C. So I would have tested everybody under my care who had ever had a commercial concentrate. The factor VIII patients, the factor IX patients. Some people had a sort of pooled plasma given to them, patients in the hospital given pools of plasma to reverse anticoagulant therapy. So this has been a big issue, hasn't it, about hidden cases of hepatitis C in hospitals. There were cases of anti-D immunoglobulin, particularly in Ireland. So we were in a different territory then of also looking for patients who'd been through the hospital who'd never had factor VIII or factor IX, who might have had Hep C. That wasn't my direct responsibility, but other doctors would quite often talk to me and say, you know, who should we be screening and looking at?
So in terms of your patients, your haemophilia or bleeding disorder patients who had hepatitis C, was that all of the severe regularly treated haemophiliacs who, I mean, there may I suppose have been a handful of new patients who had only received the later generation, but
I didn't have anybody, as I've said to you. There was nobody. I had 2 or 3 patients who only ever received heat treated. They were just either children born 84 or they were miles having their first, and none of those got Hep C, even though we now know that that heat treatment wasn't terribly effective. Mercifully, they didn't get Hep C. But I tested, obviously, there was quite a big group of people who'd had factor VIII once or twice, even some haemophilia carriers, very sensitive situation. And there was quite a big list of people who tested negative.
In terms of the treatment of your patients who had HIV, and I'm talking here about the bleeding disorder patients. I know you had a wider cohort of HIV patients as well. Did you have any difficulty in obtaining funding for their treatment, which was under your direct responsibility?
No, I didn't.
Can I ask you then about counselling? You mentioned yesterday that there came a point in time when you had a full-time counsellor at the centre. Roughly when do you think that was?
Well, I remember it was at a time just after we'd been telling patients, and I remember going with her to other meetings where we discussed with other doctors telling patients. So I'm thinking she probably started about 85, sometime 85, and she was full-time based in our centre, which was a big thing to be able to have, because there were very few. It was at a time when hospitals were losing social workers. They were all going into the community, and it had been very difficult to obtain funding to get counsellors. Hospital counsellors were few and far between, and somehow, again, I managed to find the money to get her, and she was an absolutely invaluable part of the service when the whole of the patient community was in such distress.
What kind of counselling was she able to offer? Was she a trained psychologist?
She was a counsellor, a trained counsellor. She wasn't a psychologist.
And if patients wanted it, was there a facility for them to have counselling with her on an ongoing long-term basis, or was it a one-off?
No, it was very long-term. So I say she was based in the centre. She had a suite in another part of the hospital, so she was employed by the centre, so she was responsible and accountable to me. She was one of my staff, and she was based in another part of the hospital, and we would strongly recommend that everybody with HIV saw her. You know, even if you don't think it's necessary, we said, we just think it's a good idea if you have a talk to this person. Most people found her extremely helpful, and then most people would go on quite a long-term basis. I mean, and some patients went on for several years. They would come in and say, "Is Juliet around today? I'd really like to see her." And then, of course, that service was extended to other patients who didn't have HIV, who also had problems. So yes, she had a number of patients on a very long-term basis.
And was that a facility that continued at your centre, whether it was her as an individual or a successor, up until the time of your retirement in 2011, or did there come a point where the counsellor post ceased?
No, that's still gone on. So we moved to open the new centre in Canterbury in 1995, and she transferred and was still working there when I left the service.
Then I wanted to ask you about a paragraph in your witness statement. I don't know if you have it to hand, Dr. Winter.
Yeah.
It's paragraph 112 of your statement, page 16. It's very short, so I'll read it out for those who don't have it. I'll wait till you found it.
Okay.
And you say there, AIDS was not a notifiable disease. Because of the stigma surrounding this diagnosis, it was not usual to use this term on a patient's death certificate, as it had caused significant problems with the coroner and with undertakers. And then you say no such stigma surrounded patients dying of hepatitis. And you're addressing there a particular question you'd been asked to address. Can I just ask you to provide us with a little bit more context and background for that? We've seen different practices to some extent in different areas. So in relation to your area, what were the problems with the coroner and with the undertaker that led to not usually including the term on the death certificate?
So this was an issue that caused very great distress. AIDS was not a notifiable disorder. However, as a doctor, I was obliged to inform a coroner of any death that was not natural. And of course it was not natural for a person with haemophilia to die as a result of HIV. So when I had a patient who died of AIDS who was not a haemophiliac, I did not need to inform the coroner. When I had a patient who died who was a haemophiliac with AIDS, I did need to inform the coroner. That I had no choice. I did it very reluctantly. The coroner, in response, felt obliged to hold an inquest. There was very intense correspondence along the lines from myself and the Haemophilia Society got involved, along the lines of, this is going to cause the family, who are already greatly distressed, even more distress, and if the purpose of an inquest is to establish the medical cause of death, that is already known. We know why this patient died. They had haemophilia, they were given contaminated blood, and they died of AIDS. So why do you have to hold an inquest? The coroner would not be moved. To make a bad situation even worse, that meant that at the inquest I was commanded to attend, describe the cause of death, which would then be reported in the local press. On one occasion, "Bad blood kills boy" on the front page, together with the name and address of the child. So this was, well, you'll gather, it was a very, very distressing episode, and it couldn't, every time we had a death, we had to go through this exercise.
So your concern, you talked about your reluctance, was because of the impact on families and what the families wanted.
It didn't serve me as a doctor any benefit, because I'd known why the patient died. All it had served to do was to cause very great distress to a family who were already greatly distressed.
What was the particular problem with undertakers?
The problem with undertakers was you'd inform them about the HIV infection, which I think you had to do, but they would turn up wearing spacesuits, which was inappropriate.
You said no such stigma surrounded patients dying of hepatitis. It may be because of the evidence you've given about hepatitis care being under the control of one of your colleagues that you're not in a position to answer this, but were there referrals to the coroner if a patient infected with hepatitis as a consequence of their of blood products or blood transfusion subsequently died as a result of the hepatitis, liver cancer or whatever the cause was? Were those notified to the coroner?
That would have been handled by the hepatitis team, to my recollection. I don't remember any personal issue.
And if the term HIV or AIDS was not going to be used on the death certificate, what term was used instead?
Oh, you'd use a term like pneumocystis pneumonia, and then, under 2, haemophilia.
And then I put the statement away, but I have a question about a different paragraph in your statement. Paragraph 94, please. If you go on to page 15 of your statement, so this is a question about research. You've touched on the process of seeking ethical committee approval, so I don't propose to ask you about that. Just a couple of questions again that I've been asked by others to raise in relation.
Which number?
I'm so sorry. It's paragraph 94. Okay. Starts at the bottom of page 14, but it continues on to page 15. Okay. So it's just some general questions about research. To some extent, you've already answered them, perhaps, when we looked at that Bayer letter. Any research involving your patients, there would have been, I think your evidence earlier, patient consent and knowledge. Were any of the research projects with which you were involved in relation to patients with bleeding disorders funded or initiated or prompted by pharmaceutical companies from whom you purchased products?
Well, nearly all of them would have been.
And how would it come about that you might be involved in that, or that your centre might be involved in it? Would the approach come from the pharmaceutical company via Dr. Savage or directly to you?
They would approach usually one of the sort of leading clinicians who had experience at conducting clinical trials such as this, and he would then invite other directors to participate in the study. That would be the process.
Can I then ask you about the issue of recombinants? Your statement says that you switched to recombinant factor VIII in about 1997. But I've seen from other documents, correspondence, meetings, materials which I know you've seen, that the availability or non-availability of recombinant continued to be a significant issue over the following years. You had meetings, it was raised within the UK HCDO. I think you had at least one meeting, if not more, with government ministers in relation to this issue. We can look at the documents in detail if we need to, but I suspect you can probably give us an account. What was the issue with recombinant in terms of the inability to give it to all patients?
So here we go again with a very familiar story. A major change in therapy to the benefits of patients. Was it controlled by the DOH? No. Did the DOH have any influence over how we were going to switch to recombinant? No. Had the DOH secured funding for haemophilia directors to switch to recombinant? No. The usual situation, a license is given, haemophilia doctors all over the country and the patients want to use it, and you have to fight your own battles. Each doctor has to go, as I recall, to their own finance and say, I want to spend even more money on your favourite disease, haemophilia, that you already have a low opinion of because it's high cost, low volume and unpredictable. We need to push the boat out even more. Some finance departments were more sympathetic than others. There was not enough supply to go round in the immediate changeover. Do I not recall that St Thomas's, I think, started to switch 94 or something? I think we were a bit behind them. Anyway, the point I'm making is there was a gradual change across the country depending on how active the doctor was and successful the doctor was in negotiating the change and getting the funding. What then happened, I recall, is that quite soon after 97, there was a major problem, I think, with the Bayer plant. So there were only 2 or 3 recombinant manufacturers in California, and one of them had a major lockdown because it had failed an inspection. So suddenly, the bottom fell out of an already slightly insufficient supply. So I think you'll find that some patients maybe even had to switch back from recombinant to the best of the plasma products until the problem was righted, and I'm sure that problem went on for several months at least.
And then in terms of variant CJD, what can you recall about how and when you learnt of the risk of patients of transmission for patients with bleeding disorders of variant CJD, and what can you recall about your involvement in the notification process, telling patients of this?
I've lost track of dates, but the variant CJD story is of interest because it gives a feel for the sort of continuing problems that doctors like me were having to deal with, and it was yet another COVID moment because we absolutely didn't know what the data meant. So whenever it was the year that some small number of people in Britain started to get variant CJD, there was evidence that it was due to an abnormal protein, that protein was in the blood supply. Well, I remember a period of 2 or 3 months where, if you like, we were straight back to 1983. I remember talking to Dr. Savage and saying, this could be AIDS Part 2. How do we, new disease, in blood, 1 or 2 other non-hemophiliacs with it. How do we know in 6 months this is not going to be AIDS Part 2, in addition to everything else? So it was yet another worry. So that was a real difficulty. Secondly, we had no way of testing, no way of monitoring. Then you enter a series of, how can I describe this? What am I going to tell my patients? Should I tell my patients? You're going to tell me there was very varied stuff. I'm absolutely sure in some centres patients were never told. But let's walk through. I'm having a conversation in my centre with one of my patients. So I sit him down and I say, I've got something else to tell you. You've heard of mad cow disease, and you may have heard that some patients, a very small number of patients, have got this variant of mad cow disease and died of it. And maybe I even said, we now know that some of the factor VIII you had in the past 15 years ago came from because we had nominated batches occasionally, came from a patient who has now developed variant CJD and died. 15 years ago, you had factor VIII from him. So I'm just telling you this. I haven't got a test which tells me whether you've got this or not. I haven't got any way of monitoring you as to how you're getting on. And don't worry, you'll probably be all right. I mean, all the things that's been thrown at doctors in the past few years tell the patient everything, quite rightly, which I always believed in. Here's an example where the interchange between a doctor and a patient, the patient must have felt, well, thank you very much, that's actually reassuring. I remember vividly one patient said to me, Mark, this is the 5th time in 20 years you've sat me down and told me I've got a virus. You told me I've got Hep B, Hep C, HIV, parvovirus, and now here's another thing. And he said, I thought this was very good. You obviously don't know anything about it. It's just going to get parked with the other 4, and we see how we get on. The point I'm making was, if you believed in telling patients about everything, it was a very difficult and awkward and unsettling conversation. Any patient would have gone away from that and gone home to his family and said, Dr. Winters told me this, and they would have said, well, we don't like the sound of that. I mean, mercifully, it didn't evolve into a major problem, but I didn't know that, and the patient didn't know that.
We've seen examples of notification letters, which to some extent there seems to have been some form of standard form. But in the case of your patients, you had conversations with them directly.
I didn't send them a letter, I spoke to them.
One other issue, miscellaneous issue, this one, but one of practical importance, about prescription charges I wanted to ask you about. HCDO 40264_155, please, Henry. So this is a letter sent by you to all Haemophilia Centre doctors, May 2002. And I know you're familiar with this, Dr. Winter. Prescriptions for Hemophiliacs infected with HIV and or hepatitis viruses. You'll be aware that a particularly iniquitous situation exists wherein patients with haemophilia who've been infected with HIV and or hepatitis viruses through the use of contaminated coagulation factor concentrates prescribed on the NHS currently have to pay for prescriptions for the treatment of these conditions. This has understandably caused great resentment amongst patients with haemophilia, particularly as patients attending GUM clinics who've acquired HIV through other means are traditionally ascribed a code which allowed them to have free prescriptions. And then you go on to say the Macfarlane Trust has been in dialogue with the Department of Health about the situation, but whilst there's strong agreement that the situation is wholly unreasonable, there is no immediate prospect of being able to create an exemption clause for haemophiliac patients as part of the national prescription form. And then you said that there was going to have to try and be some kind of local solution, which, as I understand it, is the reason why you were writing to Haemophilia Centre directors. Could you just give us a little bit about the background to it and how, if at all, it was resolved?
Yes, so this, you'll see that this is, I'm writing this as a Macfarlane Trust trustee, as the doctor. This again is a very classical NHS story where if you look at the back of a prescription sheet, some groups of patients are exempt from prescription charges. It's a very curious selection of patients, how anybody came up with those conditions. It's very strange. But here was a situation that was clearly unfair. If you went to a sexual transmitted diseases clinic, you turned out to have HIV, you were given a code, somebody took your prescription to a pharmacy, and your drugs came back, and you didn't pay. My patients with haemophilia, I wrote a prescription with their name on, they went to the pharmacy, all these patients were on 5, 6, 7 drugs, there would be a bill for £35. You then work your way up. You go to the local pharmacy, in the hospital, the district pharmacy, the regional pharmacy, the Department of Health. Everybody says, I completely agree with you. This is a completely unfair situation. So what are we going to do about it, says I, and nobody, I mean, essentially they would have to rewrite the back of the standard prescription charges.
Which doesn't sound terribly difficult.
Well, it was very difficult for them, far too difficult for them. So in the end, you can see the sort of note of exasperation. This has been going on. I discovered, when I went and chatted up my pharmacy, I said, how would you feel if I gave you a list of my patients with haemophilia and HIV, their names, and we gave them a code? So if I sent you a prescription from my clinics with a code, you know it's one of these registered names, exactly like you're getting from STD clinics, and you could issue them with free prescriptions, and they said, that's fine. So that's why that's the only thing I've come up with to bypass this incredibly frustrating and bureaucratic and actually very important problem. These patients had to pay a lot of money to treat an infection that they'd got through their NHS treatment, and they were being asked to pay for it. So actually, quite rightly, the patients felt very resentful about this.
And do you know whether it was resolved on a national level ever, and if so, when?
No.
You don't know, or it wasn't resolved?
I don't know.
I've got some questions to ask you about the Macfarlane Trust, but I see the time, and they won't take a huge amount of time, but they'll take longer than a few minutes. So is this a convenient moment to break for lunch?
Yes, it is. We'll take a break until 2 o'clock.